Good morning. I would like now to describe a few of the features of my dark matter motor that extracts energy both as electricity and as work from the dark energy of dark matter that is through us, surrounding us, and everywhere, uniformly spaced in this universe, as described in my various writings that are on the internet and that further exemplify and simplify, I hope, to the audience that views this, the simpleness of my dark matter motors. In this case, a rotary version of my motor. And first, this is a simple aluminum rotor. It can be of many different sizes. The first one I have is a 21-inch rotor. And what it is, this is a rotor. Each one of these dark spaces will have a neodymium iron boron or other magnet placed in them. The aluminum is not itself a magnetic material. And so each one of these neodymium iron boron or other permanent magnets will be in these. They're all completely specified, sized, etc. on my drawings for the patent application that is out on the internet. And also, inside here is a starter mechanism with 4 starter magnets that are on 2 rotors. This is one rotor right here. This rotor, on its surface of it, will have pickup points made out of soft copper to pick up back EMF, electromotive force, and miscellaneous eddy currents that might affect it. What this is, as I say, is an isometric view of a motor rotor. There are 2 required for the starter magnets and 2 required for the starter magnets. But you also have a plurality of these in any type of device. You can have 2, you can have 4, you can have 8, you can have 10, whatever number of whatever size you want to do it, and it will work. These will be offset on either side by a stator. The stator will not rotate. It stays in its place. It will contain the electromagnets that, as these permanent magnets approach the electromagnets, will turn off. And then as the permanent magnet's magnet in each individual one, in order, goes by it, it will stay off for a second. The magnetic field will collapse, and then the electromagnets in the stator will reverse their polarity, and instead of pulling this magnet, for example, this permanent magnet to it, it will turn off. The magnet will coast by that point, and then when it's off top dead center of the electromagnet, the electromagnet will then be switched to the opposite polarity, and it will push that permanent magnet and thus the rotor along. And each one of these will be happening in sets of 4 around it, so it'll keep on going on an attractive way to pull it past the stators, and then it will turn off just before it reaches top dead center of the magnetic attractive electromagnet. Then the electromagnet will switch off, and as its field collapses, its magnetic field collapses, the permanent magnet in each and every one of these will go past that top dead center point, and just after it gets off the top dead center, it will be pushed by the reversal of the magnetic pole of the electromagnet in its place as it goes by. And so then the electromagnet will push that permanent magnet and the rotor around. And that is the basic principle of this. In other words, to put it very simply, any particular permanent magnet of whatever type of magnetic material, and there are lots of supermagnetic materials, there are lots of plain iron magnets that this will work nearly as well for. It can be just a matter of adapting the design of a motor generator for any particular use, by sizing it, by having different permanent magnets, whether they're rare earth material like neodymium iron boron that I first utilized in building such a machine, or other regular permanent magnets such as iron, cobalt, and so forth. But in other words, the principle is very simple. As a permanent magnet mounted on a rotor comes past a stator with electromagnet opposing it directly, as it comes near the electromagnet, this will always be north, these will always be north on this side, and the electromagnet will switch from north to south. So as this particular magnet is coming up towards an electromagnet on the stator, which is right here, as opposed to this point, it will be pulled. The positive pull will be from the permanent magnet's north-seeking face and the electromagnet's south-seeking face. However, just before they touch and would lock, the electromagnet is turned off. And the electromagnet being turned off will still be unaffected by the permanent magnet going past it. It'll coast past it. But just as soon as it gets off top dead center, the permanent magnet, any particular one, has coasted past that point of top dead center, the electromagnet will be switched so that the face that was the south-seeking pole will now become a north-seeking pole, and it will powerfully repel that north-seeking face on the permanent magnet. And it's that simple. These are part of a starter system. But it's very simple. Once you start it, this thing will run until it wears out. Or until you turn it off, start it with a permanent magnet, and it will then run as long as you keep it running. Powered by the dark energy that uniformly fills our universe's bubble and picks up energy to give 4 to 6 billion times a second from the scalar particle, as I have named it, which is the smallest particle in the universe. For that, read my Theory of Everything. But it's that simple. You pull any permanent magnet past an electromagnet, which it's facing. You have this one rotating, this one facing, and as soon as this particular magnet, or any particular magnet, gets halfway distance between the south-facing permanent magnet, electromagnets rather, the north face will come across a case where this permanent magnet goes off. It will coast past, then the electromagnet will kick it. So it'll pull it, it'll go off, it'll coast, kick it. So it'll pull, go off, kick it. And it comes back on with opposite polarity. It's as simple as that. And it's a principle that I had played with. I knew there was energy trapped there. I knew that magnetism was not properly explained. In fact, I have a book on one of my desks that is co-authored by a physics Nobel Prize laureate. And its description of permanent magnetism is an energy of a unique kind. Well, that's descriptive by a nominative value. It gives it a name. Could have just as easily called it by one of my sister's names. Permanent magnetism is Beulah. But it doesn't describe it. It doesn't explain it in a meaningful way. And what I have done is explain magnetism in a meaningful way in my Theory of Everything, which is in many places on the internet. But the point being that I knew that as a small child, I knew that a tiny piece of steel made into a very small paper clip could move around a very powerful permanent magnet. It wasn't the energy of the paper clip that did it. It was the energy generated by the large permanent magnet and the tiny paper clip. And I knew that a motor could be made if you could somehow turn that around. I basically had it worked out in 1969. And I went to a patent attorney named Richard Seed in Seattle. And I gave him that idea and explained to him how it could be done. And he told me that I was bucking all of science since Newton, which I understood and knew. I was bucking Newton's 3 laws of motion. I was bucking Lavoisier's principles that he had worked out in enormous detail of the conservation of energy and matter. I was bucking Michael Faraday. I was bucking all of those who explained Michael Faraday's work. I was bucking even Albert Einstein, everybody in physics, electrical engineering, etc. He knew that, and he sent me first to talk with a man who lived on a huge forest in Federal Way, south of Seattle, Washington. He sent me to that man to find out that man's history. And I went there and I interviewed the man and his wife. He was old, very old. He was in a wheelchair. He was a cripple. His life had been virtually destroyed by his inventive genius and a resistance of the American public or its representatives to back him in his work. And that was the reason that my patent attorney, Richard Seed, had sent me there. This guy had spent decades before his first invention was accepted. What he did was invent the concept for creating fish sticks. Prior to this man's work, there had only been, in the freezer sections in grocery stores, 3 things: popsicles, icicles, and ice cream. And one of these products, the flavored popsicles, was a big part of the market for frozen food in a grocery store in the United States. Ice cream was the huge one. And there were, the only other product that I can think of offhand was frozen Alaska bars, which were a combination of both cookie and ice cream. That was it. But here's the introduction of fish sticks changed that totally. His invention of using partial dehydration of products in connection with putting the spices in butter so as to be preserved, and his invention of quick freezing, that is flash freezing of these goods, kept the icicles that would otherwise grow over time from breaking the cell walls and producing mush when you took out of the freezer a fish stick. But those principles, the dehydration of whatever he was quick freezing or flash freezing, the putting of the spice in butter, and then other fats as time went on, and a flash freezing process, so the ice crystals had the shortest time to grow, changed supermarkets all over the United States and wherever they're present around the world. All of the frozen goods, other than the ice cream bar, the ice cream packages, the popsicles, and the baked Alaskas, or whatever they were called, were this man's work, were this man's inventions. But it broke his health. It took decades to put these on the market. And I was getting a lesson. And that was in 1969. And I was alone in 1969 with one man, a physicist and astronomer, Fritz Zwicky, who in 1933 had realized by observing a cluster of 3 galaxies. And this is only 5 years after Hubble, who also worked at the Hooker telescope on Mount Wilson in Pasadena, California, who had only 5 years discovered that there isn't just the Milky Way as the universe, but looking through his 103-inch Hooker telescope on Mount Wilson for 10 years, Edwin Hubble realized that the nebula Andromeda was not a nebula, a cloud. It was another Milky Way. It was a second universe. Now, by my memory, we're up to approximately 1,453,000,000 other universes as found and plotted on celestial maps around the world. And we have at least 4 telescopes working every night to add more to that number. So, what Fritz Zwicky did in 1933, after we found there was more than one so-called universe, the Milky Way was just one of an ungodly number, still unknown, of universes, quote-unquote. But it was just a galaxy. In 1933, Fritz Zwicky, looking at 3 nearby galaxies, proved to himself, if no one else, that they were moving far too quickly. That is, their gravitational force had to be incredibly greater than their distances would dictate. And he was the second person to really study the question of dark energy or dark matter. The first man was Albert Einstein in 1917. He mathematically calculated that there had to be a cosmological constant that kept things from crashing into nothingness by gravity. And he later renounced, as the greatest blunder of his life, his work after the Hooker telescope on Mount Wilson in Pasadena, California, as operated by a great genius, Edwin Hubble, proved that there were lots of galaxies like the nebula Andromeda and the Milky Way in the universe. He called it his greatest blunder, this cosmological constant. But it wasn't. But no one in 1933 really was crediting the work of Fritz Zwicky. That in fact, the universe had dark matter. It was found in the concept of dark energy by Einstein, but then in 1928 that fell apart for physicists and cosmologists of all kinds, astronomers, professional and amateur, because there was not just a Milky Way, there was this gigantic universe beyond it. And Fritz Zwicky's work lay unheralded. He was thought to be insane by many of his colleagues because he got a little bit strident, he got a little bit miffed in talking about his work and no one caring a bit about it. No one crediting it with a chance even of being correct. So Fritz Zwicky was alone until I, in 1969, just said, hey, this has to exist. There has to be this dark energy. It has to be what powers everything. And I call that particle slash energy the scalar particle slash energy. And it powers everything, from quarks to everything else in the universe. And I have explained how it works precisely in my theory of everything. But to get back to the discovery of dark energy in 1917 by Albert Einstein, trying to figure out how the universe could possibly exist as it was, and then advanced by Fritz Zwicky, a guy who was at Caltech, I believe, at the time of his discovery in 1933. But those were the people that had talked about it when I looked at it in 1969, that I could see in the literature at the University of Washington libraries. And I knew that there was energy that was untapped in permanent magnets, working in conjunction with electromagnets so that it could be attracted, they could simply coast, and then be kicked in the butt again as they went past the top dead center location of the electromagnets. And I knew that a very tiny electromagnet, or a very tiny piece of iron or steel, could influence the movement of a very heavy piece of permanent magnet in its vicinity. So I knew that the explanations of physics were nonsense. I knew that, and I'd studied the work of certainly the great scientist in Germany who had come up with the uncertainty principle and led the German effort to build an atomic bomb in World War II. I knew that his published explanations of permanent magnetism were nonsensical, totally incomplete and incoherent. And that was the state of the art when I started in 1969. I'd figured out the formula, the principles of a dark matter motor, but didn't have all of the money and so forth to develop that. And opposing all of accepted science, I was going to get nowhere, and I knew that. And those were the lessons that a very, very wise patent attorney told me in Seattle in 1969. However, by 1979, I was a member with financial backing of a crew who believed in dark matter motors and were attempting to build one. We built a rotary type, and in January and February of 1982, tested it in Washington State. But it broke down almost instantly. It had incredible power in terms of its output power versus its very minor input energy, but we couldn't keep it going. I had not solved the answers to the questions that arose, and I have solved now with my dark matter motor prototypes that are published on the internet as we speak. And I'm going over right now. But it still defies all of the laws of science that are relative to it. So it's a tough trick. But one thing for sure, theory is powerless in physics or any other engineering or scientific discipline in the face of experimental results that contradict it. You just have to change the theory when it's defied by actual experimentation. In science, experiments are trump, period. If I'd had the money of Donald Trump today, that Donald Trump has, I would have built this decades ago and demonstrated it and eliminated the need for all types of other fuel for as long as this earth exists, for as long as its inhabitants are able to move the planet into wider orbit as our sun continues to grow in size until it becomes a red giant, where we'd be able to keep it in the Goldilocks zone of our sun until it was time to move out of orbit. By that time, we will have figured out how to exist in a planet without a sun. In space, it's only 3 or 4 degrees above absolute 0 Kelvin. The point being, it is that simple. And I want to demonstrate that as I go through today in my demonstration of some of the actual drawing pages blown up that constitute the essential elements of my dark matter motor drawings and specifications. So next, I would like to go to a foam core board depicting an isometric view of a motor permanent magnet showing the copper EMF/eddy current ring and mylar sheath for this particular motor. And what you basically have is a permanent magnet that has a sheath around it. First of a casing of plastic, and then it has a copper ring basically mounted to that with a gap. And what it will do is pick up back EMF forces that detract from the strength of the magnets and the strength of the engine thus, and it will also pick up the eddy currents that surrounded us, that blew up my first motor in 1982 within a split second. So the motor demonstrated unbelievable output power versus the input power, but it blew itself apart within a split second, an incredibly tiny fraction of a second. We were never able to measure. We didn't have the money for the equipment to measure at that time. My partners in the venture wanted to keep all patent rights and monies within the community of 6 of us total. I tried in vain to convince them to bring in others. I even went to the point of arranging a meeting with Bill Allen, or Paul Allen rather, and Bill Gates. And I spoke to them for a number of hours in early February 1982 about the invention and the problems in developing it for lack of cash, and asked if they were interested. Well, they were. And that can be found by the fact that recently Bill Gates, with several partners from Microsoft World, developed a combination magnetic motor allied with a gasoline motor that they have a United States patent for, as can be found by anyone on the internet. It's a combination of gasoline and permanent motor, from the fact of they built a dark matter motor without calling it that, without knowing the source of the energy, but they got additional energy in their prototype. Where did that energy come from? It was dark energy from dark matter that constitutes all but less than 1/1,000,000,000 of 1/1,000,000,000 of the matter and energy of our bubble universe. I would now like to go to the next element, and that is a cross-section view of my prototype dark matter motor. And what it is a combination of rotors and stators. These are the rotors. There are 4 rotors, and in this configuration there are 5 stators. The stators contain the electromagnets that switch their polarity from north to south, as the permanent magnetic rotors go past them. And there are 5 rotors, there's 4 rotors and 5 stators. Stator, 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 with the 4 rotors in between. And these are the wire raceways for the electrical circuits that pick up electric energy to keep the engine from blowing itself up and frying itself. And you have a keyway in here. You have the rotor brushes that pick up the electrical energy, and of course you have a shaft that picks up the mechanical energy. And the next page I'd like to go through is a close-up right here. This is figure 4A that you can see in the working drawings and specifications. And what you have here is a combination of things. You have here the 4 elements here of the interpole magnets that will act as part of the starter, and around the perimeter of this is basically a drawing on a 1-inch diameter shaft of the permanent magnets mounted. And the permanent magnets also have an ability to pick up the back EMF and to pick up the eddy currents and convey them to this outer ring, as I mentioned earlier. This outer ring, which will then have brushes that pick it off, that electrical energy, as it goes around the shaft. But you also have here in detail this 1/4 inch wide by 1/16 of an inch thick back EMF and eddy current pickup that let into the rotor, insulated on back and sides to the light bar. And this is to a light bar that will use demonstration of electric lights to prove there's more energy out than goes in. But there wouldn't be a light bar on an operating motor. But each one of these is one of these permanent magnets, and it is sheathed in a sheath that picks up back electromotive forces and also picks up the eddy currents and channels them to a pickup point on the motor. By the way, the power of back EMF was first demonstrated on July 16, 1945 at the Trinity test site with the explosion after 6 o'clock of the first atomic bomb. It was enough to put out of business electric equipment a great distance in every direction from that test site. And that energy is still the basis for missiles from one hostile nation to another to wipe out by being sent into that intersection between the atmosphere and the ionosphere and being exploded with hydrogen or nuclear weapons, regular nuclear weapons, either atomic bombs or hydrogen bombs, wiping out the electronics of opposing nations' missiles and bombers' electronics. It's still a valid principle, and it is the principle to protecting the nuclear states while destroying all those countries between them that we call mutually assured destruction, which wasn't to mutually assure the destruction of the Soviet Union and the United States, but to ensure the destruction of all the nations lying between those nations flight paths for missiles and or bombers carrying nuclear weapons. The back EMF and the eddy currents are extremely important. This figure, 5A, is a further blow-up of the insulated wires that go from the sheathing of the permanent magnets to the light bar or other means to pick up the electric energy, and to the light bar rack, or light bar and back at each permanent magnet, at each end of the magnet. These are on each end of the magnet, this assembly, and I've got it described precisely as I originally drew it. Now I have to credit all these drawings as they are in a finished form in our first patent applications for this to Earl Edward Smith, a very gifted architect who also developed his skill in doing drawings of this kind under the worst of circumstances, working with my more Picasso-like drawings, and then getting his interpretation of my more Picasso-type drawings, and then correcting his drawings where he made mistakes, and redoing it until we got what I actually had in mind and did not have the artistic skill to better portray in the first case. What we have here is a section through the electromagnets. And you can see precisely that they've also got sheathing to pick up eddy currents, back EMF, etc., and so on, so as not to blow up the rig. This page, figure 6A, basically shows the motor starter assembly, but it also shows air holes that cool this, because you do get heat whenever you have energy being produced. And you have the shaft hole, you have the electromagnets for the motor starter, and these are the electromagnets counterposing the permanent magnets that are in the rotors. So these are the electromagnets that attract, turn off, repel, attract, turn off, repel the permanent magnets mounted on the rotors. To me, it's very, very simple, but then I've been working on this design since 1969, and so that's a little quicker. What I have here is a blow-up of the electromagnets and how they're wired. And it's a very, very simple thing. The whole thing is a very, very simple thing. It's just that it defies accepted physics and electrical engineering. I have an article that'll be back up on the net that I wrote years ago called What Michael Faraday Failed to Find. And in 1831, when he found and developed the principles that created electric motors that he invented, and he invented the electric motor, he invented not only that, but he invented the electric generator, which is basically an electric motor run backwards, and he also invented systems of transformers and other appurtenances to electric motor and electric motor assembly and electric generator assembly and use in its time. And when he did that work, he had done it because, as a completely autodidactic genius, who I count as one of the 10 greatest geniuses that ever lived, had seen a public lecture of Ørsted's 1924, I believe, finding that a compass would have the effect of creating an electromagnetic energy running at right angles to that compass current. You'd have current running at right angles to electromagnetic current, electromagnetic lines of force. And he had adopted that and adapted that thinking and come up with, in 1831, his first electric motor, which I have a photograph of in my home. But what he did is stop there, figuring he'd figured out this magic thing, electric motors and generators. And he had. But it never occurred to them, as far as I can tell from his writings, that there was something beyond that. And so I have written my own treatise on his work entitled What Michael Faraday Failed to Find. And that's on the internet. Anyway, I just wanted to give a brief, non-technical description of some of the key points of why dark matter motors work. Thank you.